of the movement of the legs of the animal. And for doing that, I made a model. So I just built a model, and I worked out exactly how they would stow all the stuff that they were carrying, their weapons, how they would carry the food that they were carrying, where it would go naturally. And I would actually make the model. And once you have that, it means that whenever you describe this in the book, you know with absolute confidence that if somebody's having a chat and they're taking something off or putting something on, tying something on, you know how they're doing it. Now, we have a notion of how that happens with horses, because we've seen it endlessly on TV, or maybe some of us have ridden around on horses. But if you invent an animal, then you actually have to rethink everything about the way that the animal works, and how a human being would interact with that animal.
Do you support the idea of creating a world based on dreams or surrealism, in which everything is less solid and less real?
Yes, but you'll have a different kind of story. That's fine. In fact, I have a lot of very surreal things happening in my books, but they all happen, they do happen in dreams. The thing about it is, you need to make the world that you're designing, it has to be appropriate to the thing you're trying to construct. I mean, I was doing, to some extent, a kind of alternative history. And I'm doing lots, my books sound like to do with politics and to do stuff. And so everything needed to be very, very solid. Because I wanted people, actually, there was one thing I would mention. My book has an enormous amount of stuff going on in it, which is like, it's like a mystery. And the problem with a mystery is the most irritating thing imaginable. Because I remember some Charlie Chan films, and what would happen is, you'd be watching this Charlie Chan film, and you'd see this thing, and somebody get murdered, and something would happen. And at the end, Charlie Chan would actually solve this murder by going, oh yes, but when we were playing cards around the table, I looked under the table, and I saw that you had a boot on. Now, they'd never shown us that. They hadn't actually looked, the camera had never looked under the table. And as a consequence, the whole thing was a complete cheat. Now, if you are building something which has a certain amount of mystery in it, what's incredibly important is that you cover, when you want to try and give some hint of your mystery, something, and the way you do this is, you know, that there's something that doesn't quite make sense. It's very important that everything else makes sense. Otherwise, you can't actually tell what is clue and what is just mistakes, you know. So that's the kind of book I was writing. It required very, very tight details. If you want to produce something surreal, you're not going to be able to produce something like that. You can't have a murder mystery in a surreal universe. I mean, it just wouldn't work. Everybody did the murder. How did they do it? They just went, and then they appeared, and then they would, you know. It's not difficult, you know, to do a murder in a dream.
Something you also did quite extensively in your book was to create a language or a group of languages. How did you work the interactions between the set of languages you created, their expressions, and how the language itself would affect the cultures?
Well, initially I did. I mean, I was quite inspired in my method by Tolkien. And he obviously did this thing, he was obsessed with languages. And I felt I needed to invent a language, and I got involved with this professor of linguistics, and we designed this beautiful language. But then I decided not to use it, because, in fact, I just think it's completely pointless to be reading a book where everything, you've got all these weird words. And, you know, people, if I read a book that's, you know, got Chinese people in it, for example, they've got Chinese names, I don't actually pronounce the names in my head. What I do is I just look at the shape, and I remember it, so whenever I see it, I know it's that character. However, it means that when we're talking about this, if I'm talking to you about that book and we both read it, I'm going, you know, when said, and you remember, and you can't actually talk about the people because you don't know that. So I decided not to use languages. However, what I did have in my book were 2 or 3 languages being spoken by different people. And what I tried to do was, I used, when people talking in the court language, the very high elevated language, I was originally going to use the thou form, thou shalt not, blah, 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 but I decided that was a bit hokey. So instead what I did was I used a lot of Latinate words. Because in English, that works in English, because in English you have 2 registers. One of them is Latinate words, sound very posh and elevated because of the Norman conquest. Because the people, that's what the aristocracy spoke. And then you have the Anglo-Saxon words, and they're much more down to earth. And so by using those 2 separate registers, I actually was conveying a high court language and the ordinary language. going on.
But my question was, how did you work out the interactions between the types of languages and how they affected the culture itself? You know, like when, what we were talking about last night, different kinds of languages point to different kinds of mindsets, and that creates different types of cultures.
Well, I think that just comes in. I think I don't really know how to answer that, because that just became, because the book is a linguistic object. Language is actually it's generally not something that's in your forebrain; it's actually in the back. So I think I left that to look after itself to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
A while ago you mentioned something that I'm quite interested in. The fact that you can't mention, or you shouldn't mention, hours, minutes, seconds, and probably neither meters nor kilometers or kilos or anything like those. Those measures that we commonly use, but they are typically hours and hours in terms of European, not even in England, same kind of metric system. And I was wondering if you could develop a bit more on that, because it's something that generally is overlooked. People just allow it to go on.
It's one of those things. If you make a decision that you're not going to use any way of actually referring to anything smaller than a day, you've got certain things like a day. I mean, that's a day. You know, the sun. And then you have midday and a few other things like this. Then that makes it's one of those decisions that actually has a lot of fruitful effects throughout your work, because it means that you have to think in a completely different way. You have to actually start thinking about, say, as I did with shadows or something. And it just seems to me quite lazy if you're producing an alternative culture to, as I was saying about the church, you know, worshipping the great orb. I mean, that's just incredibly lazy. To use the word bishop, you know, any word that you use, any word that you import like that, technical word, or a shape, like a building, that you import from the real world into your fantasy world, breaks the wholeness of your creation. By, you know, basically what you do is you just have this thing coming in from the outside, it cracks it. And people will have lots of associations with bishop. Now, you can use the term bishop, but you have to use it in such a way that it goes with the flow of how people think of bishop in their heads, rather than just going, I'm just going to use the word bishop, but actually means something completely different. It's somebody who worships snakes. You know, you think, well, no, bishops don't worship snakes. You know, it just doesn't work.
It also implies that you are very concerned and research a bit about the origin of the words. I'm thinking, because, for example, it's a very lazy example, sorry, but think about flowers. The flower, a certain flower, I can't remember the name.
Yeah, an orchid, let's say.
No, but there are flowers that are named after religious things that we have.
Yes.
Imagine something about Christianity.
Yes, yes.
If you're going to use that name, or
no,
you're writing,
no, obviously,
it makes no sense.
No, it does make no sense. But it's obviously quite hard
Yes.
to avoid all references. But what you want to try and do is avoid incredibly obvious ones. That people are walking along quite happily reading your book and they, you know, that's what you want to try and avoid, because